So I wanted to talk first about how to start a story, which is kind of it's actually the main thing that student stories that I come across do wrong. So often you'll come across a story that has a good idea, good prose, good characters, but doesn't start in the right spot. I mean, so often you'll see a story that starts with an alarm clock going off. It's at the beginning of the day, it's not the beginning of the story. So the first thing I would like to talk about is a quote from Flaubert and also from Flannery O'Connor. It might be mistranslated, but both of them said, story equals trouble for the protagonist, for the focal character. No story, no trouble. So I like this metaphor that I'm about to use. Obviously that's a mountain. A boulder on the hilltop, top of the mountain. Here's a bird comes along, hits the rock goes down there. Now, I think it's helpful to think about your protagonist's life as a boulder perched unsteadily on a hilltop. To start the story, begin with the beginning of the story. Now that there are all kinds of caveats to this, I mean, I don't think any rule is ironclad, but the key thing, I think, is to start thinking strategically about storytelling. So if you can come up with a strategy, a strategic reason not to do this, then of course do it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But if you can't come up with a strategic reason not to start your story this way, then I would say start this way. So if your protagonist's life is a boulder on a hilltop, perched precariously, the story really starts, the trouble starts when the bird comes and knocks into it and sets it rolling, right? So begin with the beginning of the story. Begin with the boulder flying down the hill. Do the next thing. So stories that often do this incorrectly start with say you're writing a 15-page short story. So you're writing a 15-page short story. Often stories that don't start in an arresting way will spend 5 or 6 pages before the action starts, setting up the world of the story, what the characters like, what his characters like, and then the story will start on page 5. What better way to reveal character than conflict? So if you show the character in conflict in the beginning, we'll understand what kind of character he is, what his situation was. Again, rules exist to be flouted, and we'll talk about some reasons to do that. But if you should do so, you can make a compelling argument about why and when it's best to ignore it. So let's read a story opening to college here. Usually I have people read it, but this is an opening to a story by a man. The cobbler's son. I eat shoes. I eat sneakers, penny loafers, sandals, and boots. I do not eat any shoe in one sitting nor in two. Nor do I eat shoes for fetish, nutrition, or for eating's sake. Some of the items I have ingested have caused gas, bloating, and indigestion. I am not immune to illness, but have not gotten cancer or ulcers these 24 years, knock on wood. While for some walking in other shoes transports them to faraway places, eating them carries me. I do not plan to touch upon the happenstance that urged me to begin this peculiar habit, but I will say that father was a cobbler and shoemaker in Poland long before his name was shortened on Ellis Island, and he set up shop in Brooklyn. You guys call him here, right? If I had a therapist, you might tell me I'm longing for my father, looking in the wrong souls for my soul, but I don't have a therapist. I remember that father's love for shoes extended beyond his formal education. Each piece of a shoe had its place, knew its purpose: eyelets, tongues, and uppers, heels, toes, and soles, leather, laces, cushions. Father's only protest would be that eating shoes is not kosher. Who was he to say? After he cobbled shoes for all the officers in his army unit, and the officer who loved his work tipped him off about the planned anti-Semitic outbursts within the military. Once father escaped, he never kept kosher except loosely when he brought home taken bagels and matzo soup. Father tanned deer hide and along with cherry wood he constructed heel, stole an upper from no other materials except thread and glue. Father was proud of his craftsmanship. I ingest ballerina slippers sometimes. They taste silky and are easier going down. So, if this was the beginning to a story that you were reading, say you're in charge of a slush pile at the New Yorker or something, or you're a publisher and you're deciding whether who I just took publish an unknown author. What would you think about this as note? Anybody? Good idea? Good opening? Engaging? Yes? No?
Well, it's an interesting world, but you wonder what it's going to be. We've been reading a while, and
yeah, exactly.
we have yet to figure out what we're going to join this person.
Thank you. Yeah, exactly right. It's a compelling idea, but it's not reaching its maximum. That's a terrible word. It's not as enjoyable as it could be because it's not a story yet. It's an unstable situation. The key, I think, about this is that it begins a story in a dramatic present. So let's look at a story with an idea that's neither better nor worse inherently, but much more successful. Milan Kundera says that the Kafkologists killed Kafka. And by that, I think he means that so many people try to cram meaning out of it. They forget that it was just a funny story about a guy turning into a bug, and the meaning was secondary. The reason this is a better opening is very simple. It's not because of the brilliant writing, it's because he was smart enough to say one morning and in his bed. One morning, as Gregory Samsa awoke from uneasy dreams, he found himself transformed in his bed into a gigantic insect. Now, a guy who eats shoes and can divine the life of the wearer is, again, no better or worse an idea than a guy turning into a bug. But once you put it in a dramatic present, once you start the story with some scene, you have to make, well, it does a couple of things. One, you see the implications of that thing. We don't know how he started eating shoes, what it meant to him, what the dramatic implications were. And so also we just have to make any choices, but once you place him in a bed, you have to make choices about what the world is like. And that's the kind of stuff that brings the reader in. He was lying on his horror as it were armor-plated back, and when he lifted his head a little, he could see his dome-like round belly divided into stiff, arched segments, on top of which the bedquilt could only keep position and was about to slide off completely. His numerous legs, which were pitifully thin compared to the rest of his body, waved helplessly before his eyes. What has happened to me? There was no dream. His room, or regular human bedroom, only rather too small, etc., etc. So he places him in a room. We have to see the room. We have to understand the circumstances that got him there, and what happens next. What about sleeping a little longer and forgetting all this nonsense about it? But it cannot be done, for his constant sleep on his right side. So that's when drama happens. That's when the story starts. When the unstable situation becomes a story. When the trouble starts, not the unstable situation before the trouble. Can anyone think of stories great stories, famous stories, that don't start this way and why? Think about not doing that? I'll give you, for instance, from the world of great literature. Has everyone seen The Matrix? You guys remember how The Matrix starts? People, remembering the movie, seem to think it starts with Neo, with Keanu Reeves' character. It doesn't. It starts with something that really has nothing to do with the story. It starts with a woman, we find out later her name is Trinity, she becomes Neo's girlfriend. A woman with two other people, unarmed, in an abandoned building, and there are about 500 policemen outside, scared to death. So immediately you think, what is this world where three unarmed people, one unarmed woman and two other people, can scare 500 armed policemen? And then two guys in suits come, and then Trinity and her friends are scared of them. And so we think, what is this place where two guys in suits are scarier than 500 cops who are scarier, and those cops are not as scary as the two unarmed people? And then we cut to the story of a guy, computer programmer, who has a boring life and finds out he's part of this secret network called the Matrix. Now, I think they do that because of a couple of reasons. One, you want to set the reader up to know that the world is different from that which he expects. And that takes a little while. And also, action is coming later, and so it's a way of tipping the reader off to say, well, it's not exciting now, but it's going to get exciting later. So if you have a world that's quite different from our own, you can do that. Like Jumbo Lahiri. What I understand, her stories are not as popular in India as they are here. And I think it's because what she does for the American reader is she situates us in this world that for most American readers is unknown. She provides what used to be called local color. She shows us what it's like in an immigrant community. And I think that for Indian readers, that would sort of, the first page or two would be sort of boring, so let's get to the story. So, but she's, an amazingly accomplished writer here. Let's go to the next one. So, now that we talked about how to start a story, the next thing is here's a little formula I came up with. Because everyone thought they were getting away from math and writing classes, but I wanted to bring a lot of it. So this is something I came up with for my students. So again, we'll come up, it's very reductive to do this, but I think it's just helpful to start thinking about story in this way because it's so scary when you sit down at the writing desk. And this is all partially a hedge, it's all partially BS that when I go down the writing desk, I feel scared. But I feel like we have these tools and it helps us think about this way to do things. And since it's such a random, scary process writing from scratch, I think it's helpful to think about it in this way. So if story equals trouble, I think that another way of looking at it is that every story is basically about someone with a desire, someone with a goal. And that varies. It's much more subtle in literary fiction than other things. And then there's a conflict, something inhibiting the desire. I mean, people talk about conflict all the time, but I'm not sure we all always talk about it in a way that's informed. And then plot. Plot is really just a series of instances of conflict. Series is the key part. A plot or a subplot. A string of worsening developments, each of which involves the same conflict. Deepens our understanding of that conflict and the characters in the conflict as it intensifies. So let's think about the most elemental thing, and then we'll go into literary fiction. The most elemental story is probably a horror story. So what's the protagonist's goal in a horror story? Don't get axed. What's the conflict? Guy downstairs with the axe. Very basic conflict. What's the series of instances of conflict? It's not just a guy downstairs with an axe. It's a guy down the street with an axe, a guy downstairs with an axe, a guy in the house with an axe, a guy in the room with an axe, and then they fight. That's what plot always is. It's, in literary fiction, it's different. It's more subtle. We don't often go over it for plot or remember it for plot, even necessarily. We don't necessarily remember the plots of literary fiction. But a friend of mine, writer David Lipsky, talks about. He also teaches it. He says that plot is a delivery system for literary fiction. It's the way we can get the stuff that we like literary fiction out. So literary fiction for out to the reader. So, we come to someone like Nabokov, Laurie Moore, or whomever, with the observations about the world, for the understanding about how people interact. The delivery system to get that information to people is the plot. And most stories will follow this. Stories that don't work, the rising action is the hardest thing in storytelling, I think. That's not a quote from me, that's from George Saunders. So let's move it up a little bit. An old professor of mine, Douglas Clever, pointed out student stories that don't work often violate story structure in the following ways. The unfinished story, a few pages that introduce a slightly volatile situation, like a breakup, but that fail to go anywhere after the first scene. You just have a couple fighting and that's it. That's an unstable situation, but it doesn't progress, it doesn't move the story forward. Stories really need a series of scenes, each one about the same conflict, a deeper understanding of the conflict. And it's more complicated novels because there are multiple plot lines going on. Now there are one scene stories, of course, but I think the author then has to break them up, break that scene up in his head or her head into micro scenes. In the first act of the first scene, this is going to happen, and then that's going to happen. So the fight's going to get more and more intense. A series of conflicts are going to get more and more intense, and that deepens our understanding of the conflict and the characters in the conflict as we go. So the unfinished story will just be a volatile situation. Maybe you talk about the rock on the top of the hill, or maybe you talk about it first getting knocked down and starting to roll, but nothing happens to further our understanding of the story. The snapped in two story, I see all the time in undergrad classes. I teach grad classes in undergrad classes. The student loses confidence in the story's ability to move the conflict forward, and so the story invents a new conflict, another volatile situation in the middle. So, a student likes the character he invented, she invented, likes that the prose is good, the voice is good, everything's going along, but then realizes this isn't about anything, so I'll add something new. It seems to be a story about a breakup, but no, there's Freddie downstairs with Max. And the two stories pushed together. I was going to say something about it, it'll come back to you. That's different from a plot and a subplot. So a plot and a subplot are basically two plot lines doing the same thing. So each plot line, and it can be small plot or one plot. Let's imagine a book with two equal plot lines instead of a plot and a subplot. Most books have, most novels have a plot and a subplot. That's kind of the defining thing in the novel, that it has more than one plot going on at once. It could be a really small and a big one. But you guys, I'm sure most of you are familiar with Anna Karenina, which is sort of the perfect example of this. But actually, there are three plot lines. So let's assume that each plot line is an A to B question. Does the character get what he wants? What she wants? That's really it. Now, in literary fiction, that's often circumscribed and made more complicated by the yes but or the no but. I can make a story about anything I want, really, as long as the character cares about it. There's a good Henry James quote, which is, a story needs to be planted around the stacked stake of emotion. So, the character has to care deeply about what's going on in the story. That's not a story I can see it doesn't work. The character is too cool to care what's happening in the story. It doesn't really equal trouble. But it doesn't have to be something that's earth-shattering for anyone but the character. I can write a dramatic story, I think, about me wanting to get a suntan, as long as I really care about it, and as long as there's a real conflict. Say I'm really vain and I want to get a suntan for my wedding, but it's raining out. The residents in town, so I can't get out. It's worse and worse and worse, so things keep happening. Even anti-plot stories like Beckett. The character wants something and there's something impeding it. So with Anna Karenina, there's the plot of Anna and Vronsky. So Anna, who's married to Karenin, falls in love, has a passionate affair with Vronsky. And the question is, does she get happiness with him? And each scene in her plot line is strung along this question. Every scene involving her, once her story is started, has to in some way deal with this. And each scene itself is kind of a micro version of this. Does she get what she wants in that scene? Does she get a little closer? Does she get a little further? Now, not every scene is about that, because there's a plot line. There's a plot line of Kitty and Levin, which is a different marriage. It starts out unpassionately, but then they develop into a much more mature, adult, deep relationship. So this ends up happening because it's based just on passion and nothing else, and this ends happily because they come to understand each other. And then there's a third plot line, which is much smaller, which is Anna's brother, Steve, is having an affair. His wife catches him. He's not so passionate about the affair. The wife forgives him, so it's kind of a middle ground. So because there are these three stories, plot lines have to sort of be somehow connected in order to make sense in the same book. So all these are about love, and because they're about love in different ways, they kind of reverberate off of each other. That's what Yeats called the emotion of multitudes. This is about one kind of love, the passionate, foolish love. This is about the mature love that deepens over time. And this is about love that's sort of just a fling that no one cares about. Because all these stories are about love and coming at it from a different angle, it seems like it's about more than just the 6 people. Yeats called it the emotion of multitudes. When you write about something in that way, it seems like it's about love itself. It gives the novel a heft that wouldn't otherwise have. And so how do people connect the 2 plot lines? You know, in the old days they did upstairs, downstairs novels. Servants and the rich people going through something similar, and the story would jump back and forth. Sometimes in my first book, I had plot and subplot involved the same people. It was about conjoined twins who wanted to separate. So the first plot was about how they grew up, and the narrator wanted to split from his brother but couldn't. And the second one was about them getting married, so it was also about connection. It went back and forth between the present and the past, so it didn't just seem like it was about one thing, but it was really looking at different ways of connection. And then let's just do one more thing and then I'll open up to questions. Okay, so here's a quote from David Mann, which is kind of related to this. Oh, let me do one thing first. Other story types that break the rules of the starting with the action. Something that Ford Max Ford called Impressionism in the service of modernism. Because modernism was all about giving us reality in a different way. So like in painting, we stopped doing representative painting, and in modernism we stopped presenting the world as chronological. Just impressions come to us, and that's how we experience life. Ford thought that you should be able to do something that mimics that, but isn't actually that, because that's formless and boring, he thought. So he thought Impressionism in the service of modernism, writing is a magic trick. So if you pretend that it's formless, but it's actually formed and exciting. So he did 4, 1, 2, 3, 5, which is something that you see all the time in J.J. Abrams on Lost. This is chronological. You start with the 4th thing and you end with the 5th thing. So let's say it's a story about a bank robbery. I go into the bank, someone pulls a gun, I challenge him, he points the gun in my face. Very exciting. We stop, we leave that scene there, we go to backstory, whatever that is, that's relevant. Why I went to the bank that day. Because I needed money because my wife was going to leave me if I didn't buy her a suntan machine. Then, so my wife had to fight. I decided I'm going to take all my money and get the machine. She says, okay, if you get that machine, we're not going to break up. Better get it. And then we skip over 4 because we're over there, and then we get to 5 and we see the guy with the gun. It's a sort of cheesy, it's often really cheesy, but it's a way to sort of generate suspense in a story that is backloaded. Okay, so last thing. This is a good thing, a good quote about each scene. Because I remember I said that each scene in a plot or subplot is kind of a mini version of the story itself. Characters can get further or closer to their goal in each scene. It's kind of a micro version of this backward. Mamet said it better than I did. Every scene should be able to answer 3 questions. Who wants what from whom? What happens if they don't get it? And why not? Mamet is dealing with drama, theater. So, with literature we can take digressions. Even in Conan, almost perfectly structured novel, he has long scenes of scything wheat, which people have been skipping for generations. Okay, so that's just so each scene has to do that. I mean, again, you can sort of literary fiction you can get away with going closer or further to this, but the further away you get, the more reader boredom you risk. David Foster Wallace used to say that his sister always asked him, he remembered when he was writing the question his sister always asked him, which was, how much reader annoyance are you willing to put up with? And for him, the answer was often quite a lot. And I love Foster Wallace. best writer around, or at least this generation. And he said, anyone can write 5 people trapped in a snowstorm. The question is how you get them into the snowstorm. It's hard to write a good play because it's hard to structure a plot. You can think of it off the top of your head, so from the audience. Think of a plot that is, as Aristotle says, surprisingly and inevitable as a plot form of work. So that's why I try to put it into this formula. Okay, next thing. The basis of drama, this was said in conversation, so it's a little choppy. The basis of drama is the struggle of the hero toward a specific goal, the end of which he realizes that what kept him from it was, in the lesser drama, civilization, and in the great drama, the discovery of something that he did not set out to discover, which can be seen retrospectively as inevitable. The example Aristotle uses, of course, is that. So, that's pretty much all I know about writing. If anyone has any questions, explain or try to